There are moments in the life of an institution when change stops being something that might happen eventually and becomes something that is definitively, irreversibly already underway. The British monarchy is in one of those moments right now. Not in the dramatic, headline-grabbing sense of a single announcement that rewrites everything at once, but in the quieter, more consequential sense of a series of decisions, some made publicly, some made behind closed doors, some requiring acts of parliament and the consent of 15 independent nations, all pointing in the same direction at the same time. The palace is preparing for major change, not as a metaphor, not as a vague acknowledgement that things are different now than they were a generation ago, but as a concrete, operational, constitutional reality that is reshaping the institution's structure, its finances, its physical buildings, its line of succession, and the personal ambitions and convictions of the man who will one day sit at the very center of it. And the scale of what's actually being prepared when you look at it all together rather than piece by piece is more sweeping than most people outside the specialist world of royal and constitutional commentary have fully registered. Let's start with the most constitutionally complex and most historically unprecedented piece of this preparation, because it involves a piece of legislation that has only been successfully passed twice in the entire history of the British Crown, and which the British government is currently actively considering introducing for only the third time. The question of whether Andrew Mountbatten Windsor should be removed from the line of succession has moved from being a fringe commentary topic to being something that the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the leaders of Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, and multiple opposition party leaders in Parliament have all stated in direct, unambiguous language should happen, and the constitutional machinery by which it would actually be done, once the ongoing police investigation has run its course, is both genuinely complicated and genuinely fascinating. On the 21st of February of this year, The Times reported that Prime Minister Keir Starmer was willing to introduce legislation to strip Andrew of his right to succeed to the throne. The following day, Defense Minister Luke Pollard told BBC Radio 4 that the government had absolutely been working with Buckingham Palace to prevent Andrew from potentially being a heartbeat away from the throne, adding that it was the right thing to do and that he hoped it would enjoy cross-party support. 2 days after that, on the 23rd of February, the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister told the House of Commons directly that the government was not ruling out action in respect of the line of succession and would consider whether any further steps are required in due course. Then, on the 6th of March, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney told reporters in Tokyo that Andrew's deplorable actions necessitated his removal from the line of succession. The Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese wrote to Starmer personally, saying in a letter that his government would agree to any proposal to remove Andrew from the line of succession. New Zealand's government said it would support such a move if proposed by the UK. The Liberal Democrats tabled a parliamentary motion to release previously confidential documents about the decision to appoint Andrew as trade envoy back in 2001. That motion was approved without opposition, without even requiring a formal vote. In other words, there is right now a remarkable and genuinely cross-party, cross-Commonwealth consensus forming around the idea that the line of succession needs to be formally changed through legislation, in a way that has only happened twice before in the entire history of the modern British state. Once in 1936, when the Declaration of Abdication Act removed Edward VIII and his descendants from the line of succession following his decision to give up the throne, and once indirectly through the various Acts of Settlement and Bills of Rights in the 17th century that established Parliament's authority to regulate succession in the first place. The specific process by which it would happen now is itself a story worth telling carefully, because it illustrates just how fundamentally different this kind of constitutional change is from the kind of executive decisions that governments make every day. Under British law, an Act of Parliament submitted by the government would be required to begin the process. That bill would need to complete 10 stages of scrutiny and debate in both the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Once it cleared all those stages, it would be sent to the monarch himself for royal assent, meaning King Charles would technically be giving his formal legal approval to legislation removing his own brother from the line of succession, a moment without parallel in modern royal history. And then, because of a convention enshrined in the Statute of Westminster 1931, the change would also need to be approved by each of the other 14 Commonwealth realms, where the British monarch is also head of state, meaning countries like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Jamaica, Papua New Guinea, and 10 others would all need to pass their own corresponding legislation. Australian constitutional scholar Anne Twomey has warned directly that this would most likely be a time-consuming process involving many parliaments passing legislation, a characterization that is politely understated given the sheer logistical complexity of coordinating legislative action across 15 independent sovereign states simultaneously. But here's what makes the current situation genuinely significant beyond just the Andrew story specifically. The emerging political willingness to go through that extraordinarily complex process, to do the constitutional heavy lifting required to formally change the line of succession, tells you something important about the broader direction of travel for this institution right now. Because governments don't generally choose to spend political capital and parliamentary time on intricate, multi-year constitutional reforms unless they believe the alternative is worse. The calculation being made by the Starmer government, and apparently supported by multiple opposition parties, is that leaving Andrew Mountbatten Windsor in the line of succession, even at 8th place, even with virtually no realistic prospect of him ever actually succeeding, is constitutionally and reputationally untenable now that he has been arrested on suspicion of serious criminal misconduct. And that calculation, in its own way, is a signal about the palace's own preparedness for change, because Buckingham Palace has, by every account, been actively cooperating with government discussions on this question rather than resisting them, with the defense minister specifically noting that the government had been working with Buckingham Palace on this issue. The institution appears to have concluded that the old instinct of protecting its own members from external accountability, of closing ranks and waiting for storms to pass, is simply not a viable strategy anymore when the storm involves potential criminal charges and a line of succession that 3 Commonwealth prime ministers have publicly described as intolerable. The palace preparing for major change isn't just about what William intends to do in the future. It's also about what Charles has already decided to do right now, in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. And then there are the changes that are being prepared at the personal, individual level by the man who will eventually sit at the center of all of this. William, Prince of Wales, has been described repeatedly and consistently by sources across multiple publications as someone who is not simply waiting for the moment of accession to begin thinking about what kind of institution he intends to lead. He has been vocal, in the words of a source speaking to People magazine, about what he wants to do when the time comes. A source told the iPaper in February of this year that William is determined to introduce meaningful but careful changes within the monarchy, and that the king has had to face so many terrible things that William feels a real sense of responsibility to get the institution to a place where it can face the future with more stability and more clarity than it has right now. The word careful in that description is worth paying attention to because it signals something about the temperament of the change being prepared, not radical rupture for its own sake, not a wholesale dismantling of tradition in favor of some abstract modern ideal, but a considered, deliberate, incrementally implemented set of reforms that are chosen specifically because they are believed to be genuinely necessary rather than simply fashionable. What those reforms will look like in practice has been described in enough consistent detail across enough different sources that a reasonably clear picture is now available. The slimmed-down working royal family, in which the number of people formally representing the crown in public life is reduced to those whose work is directly tied to specific, justified, publicly valuable purposes. The reduction in ceremonial complexity, in what one royal communications expert described as velvet and plumes, the archaic elements of royal ceremony that serve more to emphasize distance and hierarchy than to connect the institution with the people it notionally serves. The greater financial transparency, including what has been described as a willingness to open the books if a financial audit is what it takes to rebuild public confidence in how royal money works. The reform of how and when younger family members receive formal titles, with the emerging vision being that titles should be connected to actually taking up a role rather than automatically conferred by birth. And the physical repositioning of where the monarchy's senior members actually live and work, with William's settled intention never to reside at Buckingham Palace, creating the preconditions for the institution's most famous building to function increasingly as a public venue and heritage destination rather than a private royal home. Each of these individual changes is, by itself, significant. The combination of all of them, implemented together over the coming years, represents something that constitutional historians have struggled to find a genuine modern precedent for: a sitting heir to the throne actively preparing a comprehensive reform agenda for his own future reign, implementing as much of it as he is constitutionally able to implement while his father is still on the throne, and doing all of it in a way that appears to have been genuinely thought through from first principles rather than simply adopted as a reaction to immediate crisis. That distinction matters. The reforms being prepared are not simply firefighting responses to the accumulated damage of recent scandals, though they are certainly influenced by that damage. They appear to reflect a coherent underlying vision about what the monarchy needs to become to remain genuinely relevant and genuinely valued by a country that has changed profoundly over the decades since the current model was established. The Commonwealth dimension of all this is also in genuine motion in ways that deserve attention, because the Andrew succession question has brought into sharp focus something that was already true but often underemphasized, which is that any significant change to the British line of succession has implications that extend well beyond the United Kingdom itself. The fact that the Prime Ministers of Australia, Canada, and New Zealand all responded to Andrew's arrest by publicly supporting his removal from the line of succession, and did so within days of the arrest rather than weeks or months, tells you that these countries have been paying close attention to the situation and had clearly already formed views about it before being asked publicly to state them. And it raises, more broadly, the question of what the relationship between the British monarchy and the Commonwealth realms looks like going forward, as several of those realms continue their own internal conversations about whether to retain the British monarch as their head of state, conversations that the accumulated crises of the past few years have undoubtedly accelerated rather than quieted. Inside the palace itself, the preparations for change are also visible in the operational and administrative sense, in the changes being made to how the royal household actually runs its day-to-day affairs. William has reportedly been parting with what sources describe as archaic systems, working through the procedures and administrative culture of the institution and updating what no longer makes sense in a 21st century context, building a management structure and an operational culture that reflects his own values and his own vision, rather than simply inheriting whatever arrangements happen to currently be in place. The granting of royal warrants to William and Kate earlier this year is one marker of this operational transition, formal authority being extended downward through the generations in a way that has real, immediate commercial and institutional significance rather than simply a ceremonial meaning. The move to Forest Lodge as the Wales family's permanent base is another, a decision that reshapes not just where the future king's family lives, but the whole logic of how the senior royal family relates to its physical estate and its built environment going forward. There's also a generational transition happening at the level of who actually does the work of the working royal family and how that work is understood and communicated. One of the most telling observations made by those who have watched this process closely is that the pace of William's takeover of responsibilities has been noticeably faster and more deliberate than palace transitions have typically been in the past. Rather than the traditional model in which an heir waits at a respectful institutional distance while the reigning monarch's team manages the day-to-day affairs of the crown and then inherits the whole apparatus, essentially as is at the moment of accession. William has been described as someone who is already making real decisions, already influencing how things are run, already building his own team and his own operational identity within the institution in ways that go considerably further than simply attending more engagements or taking on more formal patronages. This isn't unconstitutional or inappropriate. Charles himself has not objected to it, and by most accounts actively welcomes and encourages it. But it is, by the standards of how royal transitions have historically worked, unusually hands-on and unusually proactive, and it means that by the time the formal transfer of the crown eventually occurs, the monarchy William inherits will already, in many of its most important operational dimensions, be the monarchy William has been building. The financial framework for all of this is also being restructured in ways that are unprecedented in recent memory. The Sovereign Grant Bill, currently before Parliament, introduces for the first time a formal mechanism by which the sovereign grant can be reduced, not just maintained or increased, once the Buckingham Palace renovation project is complete in 2027. This is not a minor administrative tweak. It represents a genuine philosophical shift in how the financial relationship between the monarchy and the taxpayer is understood and structured, moving from an arrangement in which the grant is essentially protected from downward movement by the rules of its own operation, toward one in which it is actively sized according to what the institution actually needs at any given point, and capable of shrinking as well as growing. The royal household itself publicly welcomed this change, which is itself a signal of something important. An institution actively encouraging the creation of a mechanism to reduce its own public funding is not the behavior of an organization in denial about the pressures it faces. It is the behavior of an organization that understands its own sustainability depends on demonstrating fiscal responsibility and genuine accountability, rather than simply relying on the political difficulty of attacking a beloved institution to protect its funding in perpetuity. Taken all together, what the palace is preparing for right now is not a single defined transition moment at which everything will suddenly look different. It's something more gradual and more fundamental than that. A reorientation of the institution's entire operating logic around a set of principles that are genuinely different from the ones that have governed it for most of its modern history. Less mystery, more transparency, less breadth, more focus, less ceremony for ceremony's sake, more ceremony in service of genuine connection and purpose, less automatic privilege derived from birth, more authority earned through demonstrated public value, less palace as private home, more palace as public institution. These are not small changes, but they are being implemented carefully with genuine respect for the parts of the institution that still work and still matter deeply to a large number of people, rather than with the recklessness of an institution that has lost faith in its own purpose and is simply tearing itself down out of panic. And that careful balance between preservation and genuine reform, between continuity and necessary change, is perhaps the most consequential thing the palace is currently preparing, not just for the next reign, though it will shape that decisively, but for the question of whether this institution, in its next iteration, is capable of carrying the trust and the genuine affection of a country that is quite different from the one that formed it, and that deserves an institution genuinely worthy of its continued support.